Hello, class. This is Professor Joseph. I'm in Ohio. I came up here for my mother's funeral. Thank you. She was 95 and lived a wonderful life, and we celebrated her life. So, as you know, I was not able to be at class. I will be back on Tuesday, so we will have class as normal on Tuesday of next week. But I wanted to take a moment and talk about this week's topics, which is the Great Depression. And so let us begin. So the origins of the Great Depression are usually traced to October of 1929. There was a stock market crash. We've had a few of those even in the last few years where the stock market goes down, but this was a major crash for its time. $10 billion in investments, which is about equivalent to $100 billion today, were wiped out in a matter of hours. Although the crash was stunning and caught the nation off guard, it exposed deeper underlying problems with the American economy. And, okay, so let me move on. There was some resistance by the progressives to the growing inequality between the working class and the upper class and the wealthy. But nonetheless, despite the efforts of progressive movement, inequality became more and more severe throughout the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. Called Roaring because the economy was roaring, the culture was roaring. All that kind of came to a stop in 1929. There were fiscal policies that increased the divide between low corporate and personal taxes, easy credit, depressed interest rates, overwhelmingly favorable to the wealthy investors who spent their money on goods and speculation and speculative investments in the rising stock market. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Depressed interest rates, easy credit. That's one might argue, if one wanted to, that that's what we have experienced for the last few years. And it can have some consequences. I'm trying to figure out the controls here. As many times as I've used this, still not confident. Well, I was hoping to show you some pictures, but I'm having trouble finding the button that allows me to do that. So maybe it's been upgraded and it's no longer there. Maybe I just forgot. So I will just continue with talking about the Great Depression. The American economy of the 1920s was built on the production and consumption of durable goods. That's things like automobiles, factory equipment. Yet by the late 1920s, much of the market was saturated. In other words, everyone who could afford a Model T Ford had a Model T Ford, and the people who didn't have one couldn't afford to buy one. So the market was saturated. When new automobiles, radios, and other consumer goods failed to sell, then the economy began to slow down. You had inventories piling up. You had manufacturers scaling back production. Of course, that also involved laying off workers who then were even less able to buy radios or automobiles. Companies fired workers, stripping potential consumers of cash, blunting the demand for consumer goods and replicating the downward spiral. Also, there was a problem with the farming sector. This is interesting to me because I grew up on a farm. I bet you haven't met many people who can say they actually grew up on a working farm, milking cows and riding horses. That's me, believe it or not, yours truly. For American farmers, meanwhile, hard times began long before the markets crashed. In 1920 and 21, farm prices in the South and the West continued a long decline. They went down, plummeting as production climbed in domestic and international demand for cotton, foodstuffs, and other agricultural products stalled. Widespread soil exhaustion was happening on western farms, especially in the Great Plains area. Farmers found themselves unable to make their payments or loans. If you're a movie buff, I highly recommend Grapes of Wrath with Henry Fonda, which goes into this precise period of a family on a farm in Kansas, and they lose their farm, and they're forced to migrate to California to look for work. If you're a book fan, you can get the original book, Grapes of Wrath, and read it. Either one is very good. I highly recommend it. In fact, if you do that, let me know so I can give you an extra credit point. Either the movie, Grapes of Wrath, is black and white. I warn you, I once had a student told me that it hurt their eyes because it was in black and white. Okay. And then there's the book, The Grapes of Wrath. In 1930, President Herbert Hoover reassured an audience that the Depression is almost over. But the president was not simply guilty of false optimism. Hoover made a number of mistakes. He believed in the politics of volunteerism. In other words, the private sector should handle these problems. The government should stay out. We still have that debate today between libertarians and people who want a stronger central government. Hoover entered the office in a wave of popular support, but by October 1929, that economic collapse had overwhelmed his presidency. Suffering Americans looked to Hoover for comfort, encouragement, hope, help. Hoover could only answer with volunteerism. In other words, trying to encourage and mobilize private companies and the private sector to see what they could do to help. He asked business leaders to promise to maintain investments and employment and encourage state and local charities to help those in need. And unfortunately, it's a great idea, but it just wasn't enough in the Great Depression. Remember, I've talked to you in this course, we've had several depressions in U.S. history. Not just one. There was one in the 1890s. There were some before that. We've had dozens of recessions. The 1930 depression was one more depression, but it was by far the worst. It lasted 10 years and affected the whole world. It was a global depression. So it's called the Great Depression because it was bigger than the others. In the same way that the 2008 recession here in the United States with the collapse of the housing market is called sometimes the Great Recession, because it was a little worse than some of the other recessions. On the average, the U.S. experiences a recession about every 20 years. So start saving your pennies. I hope that's not discouraging. Sorry. By mid-1932, a quarter of all New York's private charities had closed down for lack of money. In Atlanta, solvent relief charities could only provide $1.30 a week to needy families. Think about that. The size and scope of the Depression overpowered the radically insufficient capacity of private volunteer organizations to mediate the crisis. This brings us to the bonus army. There's a great PBS documentary about the bonus army. It's about 50 minutes long, a little bit less than an hour. I might send you the link. It's one of the most shocking and tragic things in American history, in my mind. A group of World War I veterans had been promised a bonus for their service in World War I. 1932, the Congress was debating a bill to authorize the immediate payment of the long-promised cash bonuses to the veterans of World War I. The thought was to try to help them out through the Great Depression. It was originally scheduled for 1945, but now in 1932, it looks like the veterans, some of them homeless, could use this cash payout, this bonus, at that point. Remember, Hoover is still the president. Given the economic hardships facing the country, the bonus came to symbolize government relief for the most deserving recipients, those who have risked their lives, perhaps endured wounds, lost limbs, psychological trauma, those that had served their country in World War I, the most deserving recipients from across the country. More than 15,000 unemployed veterans and their families converged on Washington in the summer of 1932. Hoover opposed the bill. as a good fiscal conservative. Sorry if my voice is dripping with sarcasm, which was eventually voted down by the Senate. So the bonus bill did not pass. While most of the bonus army left Washington, accepting defeat, many stayed on to hoping to press their case, talk to their representatives, and try to advocate for this bonus. Hoover called the remaining veterans insurrectionists. That's before we had invented the word terrorist. Now everybody we don't like is a terrorist, but then they were insurrectionists. And he ordered them to leave. Thousands of them failed to heed the order to vacate. Hoover ordered the Army, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, to attack these veterans in their peaceful encampment. If you watch the PBS documentary, you'll also hear that Dwight Eisenhower was an officer under Douglas MacArthur. Also, George Patton was there. A lot of the guys who became famous in World War II were, I don't know how to say this. They were soiled, in my opinion, by firing on veterans who simply were peacefully protesting and asking for the bonus they had been promised. So they sent local police, infantry, cavalry, tanks, and a machine gun squadron and stormed the tent city and routed the bonus army. I think it's disgraceful. Of course, it was not a good look for Hoover. So Hoover's insensitivity towards suffering Americans became obvious. His unwillingness to address widespread economic desperation, his repeated platitudes about returning prosperity condemned his presidency. Hoover was not responsible for the Depression personally. However, he mishandled the crisis and misjudged the severity of the Depression and didn't understand how enormous of a problem it was, requiring major government mobilization to try to remedy the Great Depression. On the Great Plains, there was another problem, an environmental catastrophe in the Great Plains area, which was never suitable for farming, for commercial agriculture. It was for buffalo herds grazing, cattle grazing. But the land in the Great Plains was not suitable to dig up and plow and grow crops. And eventually the soil became exhausted, and then there was severe droughts from Texas to the Dakotas in 1932, lasting until 1936, a drought meaning no rain. It became the Dust Bowl, and this is the period of time that the Grapes of Wrath, I think, are the book and the movie are covering. It became a Dust Bowl. It was too late to try to do conservation practices to preserve the soil. The region's farmers were already hit by years of foreclosures, and declining commodity prices were decimated. And most of them became migrants, traveling west to places like California, looking for jobs. And that's the story of Grapes of Wrath with Henry Fonda. Also, Mexican immigrants were hit hard. The State Department made a concerted effort to reduce immigration from Mexico in 1929, and Hoover reinforced that with executive actions in 1930. Officials in the Southwest led a coordinated effort to push out the Mexican immigrants who had already immigrated and force them to return to Mexico. Of course, there were no jobs. So the lament or the platitude would be that the Mexicans were taking legitimate American jobs from people who needed them. And, of course, they had been encouraged to come during World War I to replace the GIs, and then the Roaring Twenties, they were needed. So they were encouraged to immigrate to the United States as a labor supply, surplus labor supply. But now they're not needed because there's no jobs. And so they're being forced to return to Mexico, with many of them having children that were born in the United States. In Los Angeles, the Citizens Committee on Coordination of Unemployment Relief began to conduct deportation raids in early 1931. So now you know that many of the problems we're facing currently are not new. They've been around for a while. Los Angeles County Department of Charities began a drive to repatriate Mexicans and Mexican Americans on relief. Mexican Americans. So these are Mexican Americans are people born in the United States being forced to return to Mexico. From 1930 to 1940, the Mexican-born population living in Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas fell from 600,000 to 370,000. Franklin Roosevelt was not anti-immigrant, at least not as much as Hoover had been. But nonetheless, even though that was not a primary point of his policy, immigration plummeted and deportations rose. Whenever there's hard times economically, people get fearful, and they tend to blame the immigrants. Over the course of the Depression, more people left the United States than entered it. In March 1933, President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected President of the United States and began something called the New Deal. And so I will talk about that in the next episode. I'm going to send this to you today. And remember, I'll be back on Tuesday in my classroom with my roster. And these last few classes, I'm not taking attendance, so you don't need to worry. I tried doing the Zoom virtual office hours on Tuesday. No one showed up for either class, so I didn't do it yesterday. I understand at least one person showed up yesterday. I'm sorry. But you can reach out to me with a Canvas message. That's probably more practical and functional for me anyway. So this is my first virtual lecture on American history, to be continued next time with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Thank you so much. Take care. I'll see you soon. I miss you all. Bye.